This is a video review for the Ecosystems lecture series. Now, we did a pretty good job at the first couple of videos of the lecture series to talk about climate, so I'm going to exclude that from this review. If you want like the full climatological review, watch the second video of the lecture series. It's a pretty good video already, and I'm going to add it as in this review playlist as well, because it's really good for that. But remember that the main thing you need to know about that is that there's going to be 3 zones of climate on the Earth. You have the temperate zone, the tropical zone, and the polar regions. And that different ecosystems are going to be living in those areas, or that life is going to be different in those areas. But it's not just about the temperature, it's also about the amount of water and a lot of other factors. But that temperature and precipitation is going to be the 2 main factors. And that we use these graphs called climatographs to actually show people how the patterns of temperature and precipitation throughout the year in different ecosystems to try to predict how they look like. And we did several things that you should know about climatographs to know. For example, you should know that ecosystems which are tropical will tend to have a flatter weather throughout the year. That means the temperature will tend to be more like this. Ecosystems which are temperate will have high oscillations between high and low, and ecosystems which are polar will also have oscillations, but at much lower temperatures than the temperate ecosystems. Also, among ecosystems that have the similar temperature, it is the amount of water that makes the difference. The temperature on the deserts and the rainforest is very similar, but because the rainforest has more water, you have a completely different kind of ecosystem. So these things are put together for you to understand what's happening. Also remember that in the graph, whenever you see the graph pointing up in the middle here, that means it's hot in July. That's the northern hemisphere. But if it's hot in the corners and colder in July, that means it's the southern hemisphere, because they have the opposite season over there. Remember? So these are just some of the things you're supposed to know. We didn't talk about the land biomes and the fact that the land biomes have slow-moving ecosystems where the nutrients cycle very slowly compared to aquatic biomes. But there's very interesting things. Now, among the tropical biomes, you have the rainforest, which is the most diverse biome on the world. Lots of rain, lots of water all year long. Very interesting ecosystem that sustains most of the diversity of the world, and also very indicator of a great concern on the modern science, because the restoration of the rainforest and the preservation of the forest is unique, because since it concerns most of the biodiversity on Earth, if the rainforest goes away, most of the diversity of the Earth goes away with it. I also talked about the fact that the top of any forest is referred to as the canopy, and that the bottom of any forest is referred to as the understory, and that the understory is littered with things like humus, which is dead leaves falling from those trees. But in the rainforest, by the way, the majority of the nutrients is trapped in the barks of the trees, those massive trees. Now that means that the soil itself is not very rich, and that means that cutting down the forest would just basically make the soil useless for things like agriculture, which is what they usually cut it for. So it's kind of stupid to do it. You also have, in those same tropical biomes, areas which are the opposite of rainforests, which don't get a lot of water. They, of course, become deserts, where animals have to be specially adapted to preserve the amount of water, like plants as well. All the organisms live there have to deal with long periods without water. In between, you have the grasslands, such as the savanna. And the characteristic of the savanna is that it will have fluctuations in rainfall, in a period of a lot of rainfall, and a period without it. And forests and fires will be very common in this area as well, because of those dry seasons. Now, if it didn't have elephants, this thing could turn into a tropical dry forest, where the elephants would not be knocking down the trees. And sometimes this happens also as the savanna is becoming wetter, or also if the rainforest is becoming drier, it goes through this stage of the tropical dry forest. But the factors are very similar. It's really the elephants which make the most difference. Now, among the temperate biomes, you have the deciduous forests, and it's called deciduous because the leaves of the trees fall during the fall or the autumn, and actually add more humus to the bottom of this ecosystem, which makes it very, very vibrant. A lot of life will live there based on that, and it's going to be in all the temperate zones of the world, especially near coastal areas where there's a lot of rain, a lot of humidity throughout the year, the solid amount of humidity. If there's very little humidity, but at least a little bit, you're going to have the opposite, which is called the chaparral. If you had no humidity, well, you have a temperate desert, and it does happen sometimes, like the Gobi Desert. But a little more humidity, you're going to have a chaparral. Especially, though, if the dry season happens during the summer. Now, chaparrals tend to catch on fire a lot because the dry season is when it's hotter. So they tend to catch on fire, and fire is actually very important for this ecosystem. And we'll talk about the idea of succession later in this review videos. And chaparrals will one of the ecosystems that go through that. Similarly, maybe if you have a different little set of conditions, but very similar to this one, is the temperate woodland. And it's a little more luscious than the chaparral, but instead of having the short shrubs, you have the tall trees, but except that they're going to be sparsed out instead of being clumped together like the way the chaparral was. And forest fires, again, are crucial here because, again, the dry season happens during the summer. Now, in between both of these dry extremes and the wet extremes of the deciduous forest, you have, again, the grasslands, which are sometimes also referred as savannas. But in temperate areas, we call them prairies. Now, prairies will be common more in the central areas of the continents where there's less rain than there was in the corners near the oceans. And then you're going to get, but not as little rain as you would see in the areas which are like the chaparrals and the temperate woodlands. These grasslands are important because they sustain the greatest amount of wheat and rice and all the kinds of grass that humans use to survive. So it's the most abundant agricultural land of the world, and unfortunately also one of the ecosystems which is suffering a lot because we're constantly destroying it to make more agricultural land. Now, if you were a little colder, and also if your dry season is during the winter as opposed to being during the summer, you're going to get what is called a coniferous forest, or trees which have to be adapted for dry seasons during the winter, when it's also colder. A lot of those Christmas trees which have those pine cones or gymnosperms are going to be common in these areas. Now, if this is going to be even colder, you're going to get what is called a taiga, which is a special type of coniferous forest where the trees are very sparse between them. And it's really a polar ecosystem, and it's common very close to the poles. All right? Now, the difference about that, again, remember, is that there's a little more water, but a little colder too. Now, if you have a lot more cold and a lot less water, you end up with a polar grassland, where grass is very flimsy and there's barely any trees because the soil underneath the topsoil is actually frozen. It's called permafrost. Now, that frozen soil holds underneath a lot of life from a long time ago that was now dead and decaying. That's a lot of methane gas there. If the frozen soil were to melt, and that is happening with global warming, the methane gas could escape, and since the methane gas is a greenhouse effect itself, that would increase the greenhouse effect even more. But you're not going to see a lot of trees in this ecosystem because of the fact that the trees can't go too deep in the roots. Then you actually have the polar ice cap weather, but believe it or not, there's a lot of life. Although most of the life is going to be water-based because the water doesn't tend to get as cold as the land areas do. The water has a minimal temperature pretty much. Below a certain point, the water doesn't get that cold. So a lot of the life is going to be based on fishing from the oceans and other ecosystems of the oceans, which are actually quite abundant in the poles. The poles are one of the most abundant ocean areas of the world since a lot of carbon dioxide is dissolved in that very cold water. Cold water dissolves gases more readily, you know. So these are some of the ecosystems of the world. You also have mountain weather. And the thing that's interesting about mountain weather is that as you go higher in the mountain, it gets colder and colder. So it kind of mimics what happens when you go higher and higher towards the poles, or what happens when you increase the latitude. So this is an example that mountain weather kind of mimics the same things that happens we talked about before. The bottom of the mountain might be more forestry. Then you're going to get grasslands and more alpine weather and coniferous trees, and then finally more polar grasslands, and then finally actual ice caps, just like the Earth. So it's like a mini world if you look at it. We also talk about aquatic ecosystems, which are truly the most common ecosystems on the Earth since they cover 71% of the surface of the Earth. And these include flowing water ecosystems where the amount of gases tend to be higher than any other aquatic ecosystem because the water is constantly moving around. But how fast it moves and what kind of ecosystem it's going to be like, it's going to depend on what kind of terrain it's going through, how steep the terrain is, and that's also going to help determine what kinds of plants and what kind of animals lives in those ecosystems. But this, of course, includes rivers and streams. You also have standing water ecosystems such as lakes, marshes, ponds, bogs. All of these things are different kinds of aquatic ecosystems. Now, the difference between a bog and a marsh is that bogs tend to be covered with vegetation. A marsh tends to be a little less vegetation, and then the swamp even has trees that live in the water. Okay, and swamps are going to be more common in tropical areas where there's a lot more sunlight and more productivity. and grasslands are going to be more common in areas which are a little colder. So this is an example, though, of lakes, lake ecosystems. And lake ecosystems go through very interesting things. They change through time in processes such as turnover and eutrophication. Turnover is a process that depends on the circulation of the nutrients throughout different seasons as the lakes go through different types of heating and cooling, and the density of the water changes. During the winter, the water barely flows since the top is frozen, and that stops the circulation. During the spring, the wind blows and the heating happens, and then it will move the lake around again and distribute the nutrients that got gathered during the winter at the bottom of the ocean. Summer stops the fluctuation again as the water forms a thermocline, and it's hotter on the top than it is in the bottom, and that stops the circulation as well. But then in the autumn, the circulation returns, the lake again maintains a similar temperature, and again the nutrients cycle. But then the productivity already peaked during the summer, and you're going back towards the winter again. Lakes also go through life cycles. At the beginning, they barely have nutrients, and they're called oligotrophic. But as they get more and more nutrients from the ecosystem because of runoff and the animals which are living there dying over time, they become more and more nutrient-rich. Eventually, that means more and more algae growing, and then as the algae grows completely out of control, it covers the surface of the water with algae, and all those algae are dying, they gather at the bottom, and they actually start being decomposed. Which actually, ironically, even though you have a lot of algae, ends up suffocating the ecosystem with all the carbon dioxide that's produced by the actual process of the algae dying. That's called eutrophication. And when you get to that eutrophic lake, that means the end of the diversity of the lake, because the majority of the lake populations will suffocate on the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the massive amounts of decomposition. And the lakes are actually getting shallower because all of that dead stuff is gathering. Humans accelerate this process because when we actually add nutrients to our agricultural lands and our lawns, all of that runs off into rivers and streams and ends up in lakes, and that also causes the accumulation of the nutrients to go a lot faster than they would in the normal circumstances. But all lakes ultimately go through this, just like all lakes ultimately get salty because the runoff gathers into lakes and causes more and more salts to kind of gather. Part of the water cycle, basically. There's also estuaries. Now, estuaries are water biomes between the salt and the freshwater ecosystems. That's when basically the water from the oceans enters with the high tide and mixes in with the water from a river. There's two main kinds of estuaries. You have the marshes, and you also have the mangroves. Mangroves are more tropical because they grow trees, and then the marshes are going to be more grassy, and they actually are more common in more temperate areas. Then you have the most common ecosystems of the earth, which is the ocean ecosystems, and they're actually divided into layers. The top layer gets the most sunlight, so it's where all the productivity is at. It's called the photic zone. The bottom layer is called the benthic zone, and it barely gets any productivity. The only exception is that the volcanic vents, which don't even need sunlight and could even survive without it. All the water layers put together are called the pelagic zone. But among the pelagic zone, there's two main areas. The first is the Neuritic Zone, which is the area that's close to the continents. Now, that's going to be the most abundant, productive area of the world because runoff from the continents is going to add nutrients to that, and upwelling, which is a current caused by winds, is going to bring nutrients from the benthic zone, but all the decomposers are decomposing all the dead stuff gathering at the bottom of the ocean near the surface all there too. So the coastal oceans will be the most nutrient rich, which will support the greatest number of algae per unit area, and that's basically the feeding grounds of the world. Then you have the oceanic zone, which has the less productivity, but because the oceanic zone is the biggest ecosystem of the earth, it actually has more productivity than all the other ecosystems of the earth do. Now, the major ecosystems include the intertidal zone, where organisms have to be adapted to sometimes be above water, sometimes below water, because of the oscillating tides, and it changes a lot in a 24-hour period. You have the coastal area, which, like I just said, is the breadbasket of the oceans, and a lot of the organisms tend to go to the coast to eat when they need to. You have a special type of coastal ecosystem that requires shallow water, but not too many nutrients, which means it's only going to happen in areas where there's not a lot of upwelling. So all the areas in red are out of the picture, which leaves only the Caribbean, a little bit of the oceanic area of near Australia, and the Mediterranean Sea as areas that can support the most diverse ecosystem of the ocean, which is called the coral reef, which lives in a symbiotic relationship with dinoflagellates, which is a type of protist algae kind of like thing. And this thing is very susceptible to changes in the chemistry of the water and also on the amount of sunlight it's receiving. So that's why coral is a great indicator of changes in the ecosystem, and it's actually in danger of extinction because of the global warming and over nutrification of the waters because of human interferences. Now, You also have the open oceans, which are, like I said, very sparse life forms because there's not a lot of production, and a lot of them will tend to live long periods of time without eating, or will tend to go to the coastal oceans to eat. And you have the bottom of the oceans, which have a lot of those decomposers that live without sunlight, and also based on ecosystems which are chemotrophs in volcanic vents. Those are the ecosystems of the Earth.